22 degrees below zero. The pipes in the English houses down the road had burst 2 nights before. The electric pump in the neighbor's basement had seized, and the Lapp family walked out to their yard, gripped that iron handle, and drew water. I have watched that happen more times than I can count, not once, not twice. Across 8 decades of Pennsylvania winters, I have watched old-order hand pumps run when everything else stopped, and for years, I assumed it was luck. It was not luck. It was 3 decisions made before the ground ever froze that separated the pumps that ran from the pumps that didn't. Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through is not theory. It is exactly what I watched my neighbors build and exactly why those pumps are still running today. Most people who install a hand pump today do it the way a hardware store tells them to. They drop a cylinder into the well casing, run the pump rod up through the drop pipe, bolt the head to a concrete pad, and call it done. And in September, it works beautifully. Come January, they walk outside, and that handle moves like it is pulling against nothing, because it is. The water inside has frozen solid. Here is what happens. A hand pump does not move water from the surface. The pump cylinder, the actual mechanism that creates suction, sits down inside the well casing, submerged below the water table. The pump rod connects that cylinder to the handle above ground. When you lift the handle, the rod pulls a piston inside the cylinder, and water rises up through the drop pipe to the spout. The problem is the water sitting in that drop pipe between uses. After you stop pumping, a column of water remains suspended inside the pipe, all the way from the cylinder up to the pump head. In a shallow installation, cylinder at 20 feet, frost line at 30 inches, that column of water sits in frozen ground for 4 months. The frost line in central Pennsylvania runs between 36 and 42 inches deep, depending on the county and the year. I have watched winters push it to 48 inches in a hard January. Any water sitting above that line will freeze. That is not a maybe. That is physics, and it does not care what brand your pump is. The old order families I grew up around understood this not from an engineering manual. They understood it from watching pumps fail. And from that observation, they built 3 answers. The first one starts underground, and it starts with a number. Drop a comment below if you have a hand pump on your property. Tell me what depth your cylinder is set at. I want to know what you're working with. The first decision happens before a single piece of iron goes into the ground. It is a depth decision, and the old order families I watched did not guess at it. The standard recommendation you will find in most pump installation guides suggests setting the cylinder at least 5 feet below the frost line. In Pennsylvania, with a 42-inch frost line that puts your minimum cylinder depth at roughly 7 feet below grade. The Amish families I observed did not stop at the minimum. The ones whose pumps never failed set their cylinders at a consistent depth of 25 feet or deeper. Not because the frost line demanded it, but because they were accounting for something the minimum depth ignores: the temperature of the water itself. Groundwater in Pennsylvania, at depths between 20 and 30 feet, holds steady at approximately 52 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. That is not cold enough to freeze. That is warm enough to matter. When the cylinder sits in that temperature band, the water column it pushes up the drop pipe starts its journey at 55 degrees. In a well-insulated drop pipe inside a cased well, that temperature advantage carries the water through the frost zone before it can lose enough heat to ice up. I watched one neighbor, a man named Amish, pull his pump cylinder up for inspection in the spring of 1987. He had set it at 28 feet. The cylinder was 40 years old. The drop pipe showed no corrosion at the lower joints. He greased the leathers, lowered it back down, and that pump ran another 20 years before anyone touched it again. The depth decision is not glamorous. You make it once before the pump goes in, and then it is made forever. The families who understood this did not revisit it. The families who skipped it spent their winters thawing pipe with boiling water and wondering what went wrong. The second decision is the one I see skipped most often, even by people who know better. It is a small piece of brass, it costs almost nothing, and it is the reason the water column does not sit in the frost zone overnight. It is called a drain-back valve, or sometimes a weep-hole valve, and it is installed at the base of the drop pipe, just above the cylinder, below the frost line. The valve is a simple one-way mechanism. When you are pumping, pressure closes it and water travels up. The moment you stop, it opens, and the water column drains back down into the well casing, below the frost line, where it cannot freeze. The design is not new. Experienced pump mechanics have been installing drainback valves in cold climate wells for well over a century. What I observed among the old order families is that they treated this valve not as an optional upgrade, but as a non-negotiable part of any pump installation. I never saw an old order pump installed without one. Not one. There is a practical detail worth understanding here. Because the drainback valve allows water to fall back into the well between uses, the pump requires priming strokes each time you start, typically 3 to 5 handle strokes before water reaches the spout. The families I watched did not consider this an inconvenience. It was simply how the pump worked. Children knew it. Grandmothers knew it. You pump 3 strokes, water comes. That is the trade for a pump that runs in January. If you've ever tried to winterize a hand pump and nobody told you about this valve, leave a comment below. You're not alone. I hear this more than you'd think. The drainback valve also protects the pump head itself. Without it, residual water sits in the cast iron head and the spout casting. Cast iron does not forgive a hard freeze. I have seen pump heads cracked clean through by a single night at 10 degrees. With the drainback valve doing its job, the head stays dry between uses. Dry metal does not crack. If what you've just heard about cylinder depth and drainback valves is landing differently than you expected, if you're realizing these are not folk remedies but actual engineering decisions that outlived modern alternatives, then you know what to do with that like button. And what I'm about to show you in the next 2 sections is the part that most people never consider at all. What you build around the pump, and why that structure is the difference between a pump that survives and one that doesn't. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into these systems. This is the kind of knowledge that quietly carried forward through generations, and this is exactly what we document here. The third decision is the one that ties the first 2 together, and it is the one that modern homesteaders most often skip entirely, and because it looks like extra work, and because nothing in a hardware store catalog tells you to do it. The old order families I grew up around did not leave their hand pumps standing in the open yard. They built a structure over them. A pump house, not a decorative enclosure, a functional, insulated, thermally stable shelter built specifically to hold the ambient temperature around the pump head above freezing through the coldest nights of the year. The pump houses I observed were small, typically 6 feet by 6 feet, sometimes 8 by 8, with walls built from 2-inch thick rough-sawn lumber, packed with sawdust insulation between the inner and outer boards. The floor was either packed earth or flagstone set directly on the ground, which allowed the residual warmth from the earth below to rise into the space. The thermal logic is straightforward. Even in a Pennsylvania winter, the ground below the frost line holds at 55 degrees. A well-insulated enclosure sitting over a well casing benefits from that upwelling warmth. The pump house does not need to be heated to 70 degrees. It needs to stay above 32. In most winters, the earth does that work without any additional heat source. In harder winters, the kind where temperatures drop below 0 for a week at a stretch, I watched families hang a single kerosene lantern inside the pump house overnight. Not for light, for the BTUs. A standard kerosene lantern produces roughly 900 BTUs per hour. In a 6x6 insulated enclosure, that is enough to hold the interior temperature above freezing even when it is 20 below outside. I watched this work in the winter of 1977 and again in 1994. Both were hard winters. Both pumps ran every morning. The pump house also solves a problem that the drainback valve alone cannot: wind chill on the pump head. Cast iron loses heat rapidly in moving air. A pump head exposed to a 20-mile-per-hour wind at 15 degrees Fahrenheit is experiencing effective temperatures well below 0. The pump house removes wind from the equation entirely. There is a fourth element that the old order families attended to carefully, and it sits in plain sight on every pump: the pump rod. It does not get discussed in most freeze prevention guides. I am going to tell you what I observed. The pump rod is the steel shaft that connects the handle above ground to the cylinder below. It runs through the drop pipe, through the pump head, and up to the handle linkage. In a standard installation, the section of rod above the pump head is fully exposed to outside air. In winter, that rod becomes a cold conductor, drawing heat out of the pump head casting and, in severe cold, contributing to ice formation at the stuffing box where the rod passes through the head. The old order solution I watched was not complicated. They wrapped the exposed rod section, from the pump head up to the handle linkage, with a fitted wooden sleeve. Not metal, not plastic. Rough sawn pine or cedar split and fitted around the rod, held with leather lacing. The wood does not conduct cold the way metal does. It breaks the thermal bridge between the frozen air and the pump head casting. I have seen this detail on pumps that were built in the 1920s and were still running in the 1990s. The wooden sleeves were replaced every decade or so. Cedar lasts longer than pine in wet conditions, but the iron underneath them was untouched. The same pump heads that would have cracked without protection had survived 60 winters behind those simple wood wraps. This is the kind of detail that does not appear in a catalog. It was passed from one generation to the next by observation. A father showed a son. The son built it the same way. 2 generations later, nobody remembered why the sleeve was there. They just knew that pumps built without one had problems, and pumps built with one did not. That right there is how practical knowledge survives, not in books, in the doing. Has anyone here inherited a piece of equipment with a detail like that, something you kept because it worked, even if you didn't fully understand why? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to hear it. I want to bring these 3 decisions together because individually they are each useful. Together, they are something else. The cylinder depth puts the working mechanism in ground that does not freeze, ground that holds at 55 degrees and never varies. The drainback valve ensures that no water column sits above the frost line between uses, removing the primary failure point entirely. The pump house holds the surface components in a thermal envelope that the wind cannot reach and the cold cannot easily penetrate. The rod sleeve breaks the last thermal bridge. These are not redundant decisions. Each one addresses a different failure mode. Remove any one of them and you have introduced a vulnerability. I have watched pumps fail from each of these causes separately. I have never watched a pump fail that had all 4 elements correctly installed. The families who built these systems were not engineers with degrees. They were farmers who had watched pumps fail and decided they would not watch that again. They observed what failed and why. They built the correction into the next pump, and then the next generation built it the same way because the pump worked. And there was no reason to change it. That is what I have spent 80 years watching, not innovation for its own sake, preservation of what worked. These pumps are still standing on farms across Lancaster County. They ran last winter. They will run next winter. The decisions that made that possible were made before the ground froze, quietly, deliberately, by people who understood that preparation is not optional when the temperature drops to 20 below and the nearest hardware store is 12 miles away. Modern alternatives came and went. Electric submersibles, pressure tanks, heat tape wrapped around pipes. I watched neighbors install all of them. I watched some of them fail. The hand pump with the cylinder at 25 feet, the drainback valve at the base, the pump house overhead, and the wooden rod sleeve. I watched that run through every winter I can remember. If this is the kind of thing you want to keep learning, the systems that outlived everything built to replace them, leave a like so I know this is worth going deeper on. And share this with someone who's thinking about water independence. They need to hear this before the ground freezes, not after. The pump that ran at 22 below was not lucky. It was built right before the cold came, and now you know exactly how. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more in the same world. Thanks for being here. Pick whichever video on the end screen calls to you.